What would you do if the only family you had left told you to be gone by morning? What if you used the last of your money to buy a place everyone called worthless, a place drowned in water and sorrow? And what if, buried in the heart of that ruin, lay a secret that could build a kingdom? Alara stood in the hallway of the house she had always known, but it was no longer a home. It was merely a property, an asset to be liquidated. At 24, she had the quiet stillness of someone who had learned to listen more than she spoke, a trait inherited from her grandfather. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and capable, marked by pine resin and the faint metallic scent of well-oiled tools. Her uncle, Marcus, stood before her, not with the warmth of family, but with the detached efficiency of a banker closing an account. He was her father's half-brother, a man who had always viewed her and her father's practical pursuits with a thin, barely veiled disdain. He saw dirt under the fingernails, not as a sign of honest work, but as a lack of ambition. "The sale is final," he said, his voice as dry as the legal documents he held. He did not look at her, focusing instead on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. "The new owners will take possession Friday. You have until tomorrow morning." She did not cry. She did not plead. The grief for her parents was a settled thing, a heavy stone at the bottom of a deep well, and this administrative eviction was just another ripple on the surface. She had known this was coming since the day Marcus had arrived with his leather briefcase and his scent of city smoke and stale paper. He saw a house full of memories. He saw only board feet and property lines. He slid a thin envelope across the polished surface of the hall table. "Your father's affairs were disordered. After settling his debts, this is what remains of your inheritance." Alara picked it up. It was insultingly light. Inside were a few worn banknotes, a sum that might keep a person for a month if they were frugal to the point of starvation. It was a severance, a dismissal. It was the price of her entire childhood. She nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head. The gesture was an acceptance of the fact, not of its fairness. Her uncle seemed relieved by her lack of emotion. He cleared his throat. "I trust you'll be practical." It was not a wish for her well-being. It was a demand that she not become a problem he would have to solve. That night, she did not pack memories. She did not take the porcelain dolls from her childhood room, or the faded photographs from the mantel. They belonged to a life that was now over, a door that had been closed and locked by a man who held the key. Instead, she went to her grandfather's workshop in the old carriage house. The air inside was cool and smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and thyme. This was her true inheritance, the place where she had learned the language of wood and metal, of stress and tolerance, of how to make things true and strong. Her grandfather had been a surveyor, a man who read the land in contours and elevations. He believed the world could be understood through careful measurement and honest work. "Measure twice, cut once," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "That's a lesson for lumber and for life, Ellie." He had taught her how to read a vernier scale, how to sharpen a saw, how to trust the silent, perfect authority of a plumb bob. He had taught her that competence was a fortress, a shelter no one could take from you. From the wall, she took down the heavy leather case that held his most prized possession. She unbuckled the stiff straps and opened the lid. Nestled in worn, dark blue velvet lay the Transit theodolite. It was a thing of heavy, lacquered brass, a complex assembly of lenses, levels, and precisely engraved dials. It was a tool for finding true north, for measuring the angle of the stars, for plotting a path through an untamed wilderness. To her, it was her grandfather's soul made manifest, solid, precise, and unwavering. She ran her fingers over the cool metal, the weight of it a familiar comfort. This she would take, this, and a canvas satchel with his best hand tools, a dovetail saw, a set of chisels, a small hand plane, a rock hammer. These were the things that had value. The next morning, as the sun cast long, cool shadows across the lawn, Alara walked down the gravel drive for the last time. She did not look back. The house was a ghost, and she had no interest in being haunted. She carried the heavy satchel in one hand and the theodolite case in the other, her posture straight, her face set. She had the insulting pittance from her uncle in her pocket, and a legacy of skill in her hands. One was paper, the other was steel and brass. She knew which one would last. Her journey was a study in erasure. She took a train west, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a steady, unfeeling heartbeat, carrying her away from everything she had known. She watched the gentle, rolling hills of her youth flatten into plains, then buckle and rise into the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the high territory. The air grew thinner, sharper, scented with pine and the cold promise of stone. It was a landscape that did not suffer fools. She disembarked in a settlement that was little more than a raw gash in the wilderness, a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. It was called Terminus. The name was fitting. It felt like the end of the line. The talk in the dusty streets was of silver, of veins that had run deep and then vanished, of fortunes made and, more often, lost. The optimism of a boomtown had long since faded, leaving behind a residue of stubbornness and weary hope. She found a room in a boarding house, a small, clean space that smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. For 2 days, she listened. She sat in the corner of the town's only saloon, nursing a single sarsaparilla, and let the conversations wash over her. She heard stories of claims staked and claims jumped, of rockfalls and bad air, of the ever-present, all-consuming search for color in the rock. And then she heard a name, spoken first as a joke, then followed by a round of coarse laughter. "The Sorrowful Siren," a grizzled prospector snorted, wiping foam from his beard. "More like the Drowned Rat. Ain't nothing there but bad luck and deep water." Another man, this one with the soft hands of a clerk, chimed in. "Still on the county rolls. Up for auction for back taxes tomorrow. $50 for the deed to 160 acres of worthless rock and a hole that'll swallow you whole." The men laughed again. The story, as Alara pieced it together, was a local legend of failure. The Sorrowful Siren had been a promising silver strike decades ago, discovered by a man named Alistair Finch. But a catastrophic flood, a sudden breach of an underground river, had filled the shafts almost overnight. The mine had been abandoned, deemed impossible to reclaim. It was a tomb, a monument to hubris, a place where the mountain had decisively won, a hole full of water, a place no one wanted. The words echoed in her mind, striking a strange chord of kinship. She, too, was a vessel of loss, a place others had deemed empty and abandoned. The idea took root, a small, defiant seed in the barren ground of her future. The next morning, she walked to the Territorial Land Office. The building was little more than a shack, smelling of stale cigar smoke and the dry decay of old paper. The clerk, a man named Silas with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked at her with undisguised boredom. He was the man she had seen in the saloon. "Help you?" he asked, not looking up from his ledger. "I'm here about the auction for the Sorrowful Siren property," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. Silas finally raised his head, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He looked at her worn but clean dress, at the determined set of her jaw. "The auction's in an hour, but there won't be any other bidders, miss. You can have it for the minimum, $50. He smirked. "Cash?" The sum was nearly a third of her entire fortune. It was a reckless, foolish gamble. But her grandfather had taught her to look past the surface, to read the underlying structure of things. Everyone saw a failed mine. She saw 160 acres. She saw timber. She saw stone. She saw a place that could not be taken from her because no one else wanted it. A place to make a stand. She reached into her pocket and laid the banknotes on the scarred wooden counter. 5 worn $10 bills. The clerk's smirk widened into a grin. He counted the money with theatrical slowness. "Sold," he declared to the empty room, his voice laced with irony. "To the young lady with more dollars than sense." He spent the next few minutes filling out the deed with a scratchy pen, the sound loud in the silence. He sanded the ink, stamped it with a heavy seal, and pushed it across the counter. As she took the document, the legal proof that she now owned a local joke, she saw him catch the eye of a man who had just entered. They shared a silent, knowing laugh at her expense. Alara folded the deed and placed it in her satchel. She felt their amusement like a physical weight, but it did not cow her. It hardened something inside her, crystallizing her resolve into a diamond point of purpose. Let them laugh. Laughter was air. The deed in her bag was paper and ink, but it represented earth and rock, solid things. She walked out of the office and into the thin mountain sunshine, the owner of a ruin. The journey to her new property took the rest of the day. She bought a few supplies, hardtack, dried beans, a small cast-iron skillet, and walked. The road quickly devolved into a faint track, climbing steadily into the high country. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the crunch of her boots on the trail. The weight of the theodolite on one shoulder and the satchel on the other was a grueling burden, but she leaned into it, a familiar ache of honest labor. She saw it from the last rise, and her heart, which had been beating with a fragile, defiant hope, sank into a cold pit of despair. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. The word ruin was too generous. It was a scar, a wound in the earth that had been left to fester. The headframe over the main shaft was a skeleton of blackened, rotted timbers, leaning at a drunken angle against the sky. The outbuildings were little more than foundation stones choked with weeds and aspen saplings. And the water. The clerk hadn't been exaggerating. The main adit, the entrance to the mine, was not a dark hole in the mountainside, but the mouth of a massive, unnatural spring. A perfectly still, dark green pool of water filled it to the brim, silent and menacing. It looked ancient, as if it had been there forever. There was no sign of the disaster, no debris field or evidence of a torrent, just this placid, bottomless well where a mine should be. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the laughter of the men in the land office echoed in her ears. She had bought a grave. She had traded her meager future for a ghost story. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. A cold wind swept down the valley, carrying the scent of snow. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only imperative. She scanned the wreckage, her grandfather's voice in her head. Find the high ground. Find the solid ground. Slightly uphill from the flooded entrance, one structure stood apart from the rest. It was a small, square building made of massive, rough-hewn granite blocks. Its roof had partially collapsed on one side, leaving a gaping hole to the sky. But the walls themselves looked as solid as the mountain they had been cut from. The assay office, she guessed. A place where stone was tested, where value was determined. It felt appropriate. She pushed open the heavy plank door, which groaned on its one remaining hinge. The interior was a mess of debris, fallen timbers, and a thick carpet of dust and pine needles that had blown in over the years. But in the far corner, beneath the part of the roof that still held, it was dry. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its gaping maw black with the soot of long-dead fires. This would be her shelter. This would be her home. For the next week, she worked from dawn until dusk, her world shrinking to the confines of that small stone building. The labor was punishing, but it was a familiar pain. It silenced the fearful whispers in her mind, replacing them with the simple, satisfying ache of tired muscles. She cleared the debris, shoveling out decades of accumulated filth. She used her saw to cut the fallen roof timbers into firewood. With leverage and patient effort, she wrestled the largest of the fallen stones out of the interior. Slowly, methodically, a space was cleared. An order was imposed. She swept the stone floor until it was clean, the rhythmic scrape of her makeshift broom a comfort in the immense silence. She patched the hole in the roof with salvaged planks and canvas, a temporary fix against the coming winter. She slept on a bed of pine boughs in the corner, the heavy theodolite case next to her, a brass and leather guard dog in the dark. It was while cleaning the great stone hearth that she found it. Her grandfather had taught her masonry, the art of seeing how stones fit together, of understanding the forces of weight and balance. As she brushed the thick soot and dust from the fireplace, her fingers traced the lines of the mortar. The walls of the office were built of irregular fieldstone, but the hearth and chimney were made of precisely dressed granite blocks. It was the work of a master. And at the base of the hearth, just to the right of the firebox, was a single stone that was different. The difference was subtle, something a casual eye would never notice. The mortar line around it was infinitesimally thinner than the others. The surface of the stone, when she looked closely, bore a different kind of tool mark. Not the broad, shaping scars of the quarry chisel, but a finer, more precise scoring near the edge. It was a mark of intention. She pressed on it. Nothing. She tried to find purchase in the thin mortar line with the tip of a chisel, but it was solid. Yet the feeling persisted. It was an anomaly, a question asked in the language of stone. She remembered a trick her grandfather had shown her, a way to find hollows in rock. She took her small rock hammer and began tapping gently on the stones around the hearth, listening to the sound. Tap, tap, tap. A solid, dull thud. Tap, tap, the same. She moved to the anomalous stone. Tap. The sound was different. Not hollow, exactly, but a slightly higher pitch, a resonance that spoke of a small void behind it. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She took a fine chisel and her hammer and began to work, not on the stone itself, but on the mortar. It was harder than the rest, a different mix. It took an hour of patient, careful work, chipping away tiny fragments, not wanting to damage the stone. Finally, she had cleared a deep groove along the top edge. She inserted the tip of a small crowbar and gently, cautiously, applied pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of stone on stone, the block moved. It didn't come out. It pivoted inward, swinging silently on a hidden, masterfully crafted pin. It revealed a dark, rectangular cavity, a man-made cave inside the heart of the chimney. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, smelling of dust and something else, something metallic and old. Reaching into the darkness, her fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. She gripped the handle and pulled. It was heavy. She dragged it out into the dim light of the room. It was a tin lockbox, the kind used for valuable documents, its edges sealed with dark, hardened wax. It was bound with 2 leather straps, brittle with age. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seals and pried at the lid with her chisel. It sprang open with a rusty sigh. She stared, her breath catching in her throat. The box was filled to the brim with coins. Not silver, but gold. Stacks of $20 double eagles, gleaming with a soft, buttery luster in the dusty shafts of light. They were packed so tightly, there was barely any room to spare. It was a fortune, a king's ransom, more money than she had ever imagined in her life. Beneath the top layer of coins, her fingers found something else. It was a package, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. She carefully lifted it out. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with use. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, precise script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The first page read, "The property of Alastair Finch, surveyor and proprietor, the sorrowful Siren Mine." She sank back on her heels, the weight of the gold forgotten. She had found the voice of the man who had built this place. She lit a lamp, the gold coins scattering the light in 1,000 brilliant points around the small room, and began to read. Alastair Finch's journal was not a record of despair, but a testament to meticulous planning and a deep, abiding love for his work. He wrote of the geology of the region, of the thrill of finding the first traces of the silver lode, a vein so rich he called it a river of stars. He detailed the construction of the assay office, his pride in the stonework evident in his careful descriptions. He was a man like her grandfather, a man who believed in precision, in building things to last. Then the tone of the journal began to darken. He wrote of his partner, a man from back east named Thorne, who had provided the capital for the machinery. Thorne was a man of ledgers and profits, with no feel for the stone, no respect for the mountain. Alistair described his growing unease, the way Thorne's eyes would glitter with a hungry arithmetic when he looked at the assay reports. He suspected Thorne was planning to force him out, to steal the mine that was Alistair's life's work. The betrayal, when it came, was more brutal than he had imagined. In a section titled, "The Great Betrayal," Alistair detailed his discovery. Thorne hadn't just been planning a legal swindle. He had been tampering with the mine's new steam-powered dewatering pumps. He was planning to flood the lower shafts to create a disaster that would bankrupt the company, allowing him to buy the claim for pennies on the dollar, believing Alistair would be ruined and forced to flee. But Alistair had made his own discovery, a secret he had told no one, not even Thorne. The River of Stars, the silver vein, was merely a precursor. His deep test bores had revealed the mine's true treasure. Far below the silver, in a stratum of hard quartz, lay a massive, primary lode of gold. The silver was a distraction. The gold was a kingdom. Anticipating Thorne's treachery, Alistair had acted first. Over a series of nights, he had moved his personal savings, the gold he had amassed from earlier ventures, into the hidden compartment in the hearth. He had prepared for the flood. He saw it not as a disaster, but as a lock. The water would hide the mine's true potential, keeping it safe from greedy, impatient men like Thorne. He planned to let Thorne trigger the flood, bankrupt himself in the process, and then, after Thorne had given up and left, Alistair would return, buy back his own mine, and begin the slow, methodical work of reclaiming his hidden kingdom. But the journal's final entry was frantic, dated the very day of the flood. Thorne had acted sooner than he expected. "He has sabotaged the main pumps and the structural supports in the lower gallery," Alistair wrote, his elegant script devolving into a desperate scrawl. "The collapse is imminent. I am going down, not to save the silver, but to trigger a deeper rockfall, to seal the lower chambers and protect the gold lode from his eventual dredging operations. I do not know if I will make it back to the surface. The siren is singing her last song for me." There were no more entries. Alistair Finch had gone down into the darkness and had never come out. He had entombed himself to protect his legacy. The last page was written in a calmer hand, as if penned before that final, fatal day. It was a letter to the future, to the person who would one day find his cache. "To the finder of this journal," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to return, but my work remains. The gold in this box is not a treasure to be squandered. It is a tool. It is the means to finish what I began. The water that fills these shafts is a lock, and you now hold the key. Do not be daunted by its depth. The true heart of the siren is not what was lost, but what lies protected. Drain the deep shaft. Claim the lode. Use this gold not for greed, but to build. Let this place be a home for the steady hand and the true heart. I bequeath to you my dream. Do not let it drown." Alara closed the journal, her hands shaking. Tears streamed down her face, the first she had shed since her parents' death. They were not tears of grief, but of a profound, aching gratitude. This man, this stranger from across the decades, had spoken to her. His story of betrayal mirrored her own. His belief in competence, in building, was the same creed her grandfather had taught her. He hadn't just left her a fortune, he had left her a purpose. He had passed a torch through time, and she was now its keeper. The laughter of the men in the land office was a distant, meaningless sound. They had sold her a flooded mine. Alistair Finch had given her a kingdom. The first rays of dawn found Alara not sleeping, but planning. The gold coins were spread across the floor, a glittering map of possibilities. The journal lay open beside her, a blueprint for the future. Alistair's words had transformed her despair into a cold, clear resolve. The work ahead was monumental, almost impossible, but she had the two things she needed, the means and the will. Her first trip back to Terminus was a different kind of journey. She walked not as an outcast, but as a woman with a secret. She went to the freight office, a large, dusty warehouse run by a formidable woman named Sarah. Sarah was the practical, no-nonsense hub of the town's commerce. She had a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and she had seen Alara buy the Siren Deed. Her expression was one of pity, mixed with contempt. Alara did not waste time with pleasantries. She handed Sarah a list. It was long and specific. A steam-powered water pump of the largest size available, hundreds of feet of iron pipe, a wagon load of milled lumber, blasting powder, fuses, tools, and 6 months' worth of provisions. Sarah scanned the list, her eyebrows rising higher with each item. She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Quite an optimist, aren't you? This is a fortune's worth of equipment. Who's backing your folly?" Alara said nothing. She reached into her satchel and placed a single $20 gold piece on the counter. The coin shone against the dark, worn wood. Sarah fell silent. She picked it up, tested its weight in her palm, bit it. Her eyes narrowed, all traces of mockery gone, replaced by a shrewd, calculating respect. This was a language she understood perfectly. "I can have the pump brought in on the next train," she said, her voice all business. "The rest I have in stock. It'll take a week to haul it all up to your claim, and it will cost you a great deal more than one coin." "I am aware," Alara said. "You will be paid in full upon delivery." The transaction changed everything. News in a town like Terminus traveled faster than a telegraph. The girl who had bought the drowned rat was no fool. She was an heiress, or a madwoman with a fortune to burn. The laughter died down, replaced by a baffled, intense curiosity. The arrival of the equipment marked the beginning of the great work. The massive steam pump, a monstrous thing of iron and brass, was dragged up the mountain by a team of 20 mules. Alara, using Alistair's journal and her grandfather's surveying knowledge, had already cleared and leveled a site for it. The work was slow, methodical, and backbreaking. She learned the rhythms of the steam engine, the hiss of the boiler, the powerful thumping heartbeat of the piston. Her solitary labor did not go unnoticed for long. One afternoon, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was a tall, stooped man with a wild shock of white hair and a beard that reached his chest. His hands were the size of hammers, blackened and scarred. It was Jedediah, the town blacksmith, a man who lived even more reclusively than she did. He had seen the smoke from her chimney for weeks, and the sight of the steam pump being installed had finally drawn him out. He watched her for nearly an hour, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she checked the pressure gauge, the way she expertly tightened a leaking valve, the precise, economical way she moved. He was a man who understood machinery, and he recognized a kindred spirit. He finally spoke, his voice a rusty growl. "That's a Kincaid pump. Good machine, but your primary drive shaft is misaligned by 1/4 of an inch. You'll throw the belt inside a week." Alara stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She checked the shaft with her own calipers. He was right. She had been so focused on the plumbing that she had rushed the final assembly. "I see that," she said. "Thank you." Jedediah grunted. "You need a forge to heat and reset the mounting bracket." "I have one." He paused. "My trip hammer's main gear is cracked. Needs to be brazed. But the gearing is complex. I can't get it seated right." It was not an offer of help. It was a proposal of trade. Competence for competence. "I know gears," Alara said. And so an alliance was forged. She spent 2 days at his smithy, a cavern of smoke and firelight, helping him dismantle and repair the massive trip hammer. She used her grandfather's theodolite to ensure the alignment of the gears was perfect to 1/100th of a degree. In return, he forged her a new set of custom tools, reset the pump's mounting bracket, and showed her how to temper steel. They barely spoke, communicating instead through the shared language of work, in the ring of hammer on anvil, in the precise fit of metal on metal. Her second ally was Elias, the old trapper who was the town's unofficial historian. He appeared one evening as she sat by her fire, a silent specter emerging from the twilight. He carried the scent of wood smoke and leather. He had known the legend of the siren his whole life. "They say Alistair Finch's ghost haunts this place," he said, his voice quiet. "The only thing haunting this place is water," Alara replied. Elias smiled, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. Finch was a good man, a true man of the mountains. He deserved better than he got. He shared stories of the early days, of the betrayal by Thorn, of how the town had mourned Alistair. He also shared his knowledge of the land, pointing out the best stands of timber for shoring up the mine shaft and warning her of the signs of an early winter. He asked for nothing in return, only to bear witness to her work, to see an old wrong being righted. With Jedediah's steel, Sarah's supplies, and Elias's wisdom, the work accelerated. The pump thundered to life, and a great iron pipe began to vomit a torrent of dark, cold water down the mountainside. Day after day, the water level in the mine shaft dropped, first by inches, then by feet. The silent, placid pool became a swirling vortex. The top of the original mine entrance was exposed, then the first few feet of the timbered shaft. Silas, the clerk from the land office, made the trip up from town, his curiosity having finally overcome his sloth. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his jaw slack. He saw the restored assay office, now a proper home with a sound roof and a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. He saw the massive pump, roaring like a dragon. He saw the neatly stacked piles of lumber and equipment. He saw Alara, covered in grease and grime, directing the work with an air of absolute authority. He saw the impossible happening. He turned and left without a word, his face a mask of disbelief. The joke was no longer funny. The dewatering took months. As the water receded, it revealed the history of the disaster. Broken timbers, twisted ore carts, the sad detritus of a workplace abandoned in a panic. Alara, with Jedediah's help, began the dangerous work of re-timbering the shaft, making it safe to descend. It was a slow, perilous dance with gravity and geology. And then came the test. The weather turned early that year. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue, turned a sullen gray. A wind rose from the north, sharp and cruel, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. Within a day, it was a full-blown blizzard, a whiteout that buried the world in a silent, suffocating blanket. The passes closed. Terminus was cut off. The blizzard raged for 3 days. When it finally broke, the landscape was transformed, a world of brilliant white and deep blue shadows. But the beauty masked a crisis. The town's water flume, a long wooden aqueduct that snaked down the mountain and powered the small grist mill, had frozen solid and then burst its seams under the pressure. The town had no power, and, more importantly, its primary source of fresh water was gone. It was a slow-motion disaster. A town meeting was held in the saloon. The mood was grim. It would take weeks to repair the flume, and they might not have that long. It was Elias who spoke up. "The girl at the siren mine," he said. "She has a pump, and she has steam." A small delegation, led by Sarah and a skeptical town councilman, made the arduous journey up to the mine on snowshoes. They found Alara not idle, but already at work. She had known the flume would be a weak point. She was studying a set of Alistair's old survey maps. "Finch located a geothermal spring about half a mile east of here," she explained, pointing to a spot on the map. He planned to tap it for the mine's winter water supply. The water runs hot. It won't freeze. The councilman scoffed. That's half a mile of impassable snow. We can't build a new flume in these conditions. We don't have to, Alara said. She unrolled another schematic. We can run a temporary line. I have the iron pipe, and I have the timbers to build the trestles, but I'll need help. It was a moment of decision for the town. They could trust this strange, solitary woman, or they could face a winter of thirst and hardship. Sarah made the choice for them. What do you need? She asked. What followed was a marvel of engineering and community effort. Guided by Alara's precise instructions, the people of Terminus became her crew. Using her grandfather's theodolite, she surveyed a path for the pipeline, a perfect gradient from the spring down to the town's reservoir. Men who had spent their lives digging for rock now found themselves digging trenches and setting support timbers under her watchful eye. Jedediah's forge ran day and night, creating the custom fittings and brackets they needed. Alara was everywhere, checking measurements, solving problems, her quiet competence a steadying force against the panic. She used the mine's steam engine to power a winch, dragging the heavy iron pipes through the deep snow. She led the crew that laid them, her hands ensuring every joint was tight, every section secure. She was not a boss, but a lead worker, her effort inspiring the same from everyone else. They worked for 4 days straight, fueled by Sarah's provisions and Alara's unwavering resolve. On the 5th day, she opened the final valve. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came a distant rumble, growing louder and louder. A cheer went up as a gush of warm, steaming water poured from the end of the pipe into the town's reservoir. It was life. It was salvation. Alara had saved them. She had used the tools of her inheritance, the resources of her predecessor, and the strength of her own 2 hands to rescue the very people who had once laughed at her. The following spring, the world was reborn. As the great melt began, Alara finally reached the bottom of the main shaft. Behind a wall of rock, just as Alistair's journal had described, she found it. It was not a vein of gold. It was a solid wall of quartz, shot through with thick, breathtaking seams of the raw, yellow metal. It was Alistair's kingdom, and now it was hers. But the gold was no longer the goal. It was simply the means. The town of Terminus, bound to her by the shared ordeal of the blizzard, was changing. New families, drawn by the promise of steady work at the now legendary Siren Mine, began to arrive. Jedediah, with a new forge funded by Alara, was training apprentices. Sarah's freight company was booming, supplying the growing community. The sorrowful siren was no longer a name spoken with scorn, but with a kind of awe. It was not just a mine, it was the heart of a thriving settlement. The story ends not with a great discovery, but on a quiet afternoon 2 years later. Alara stood in her home, the old assay office, now expanded and filled with light. It was a place of warmth and peace. On a large drafting table, she was poring over a new set of plans, not for a deeper mine shaft, but for a schoolhouse. The town needed one. She had the means, and she had the skill. On the corner of the table, 2 objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's brass theodolite, its metal glowing with a soft patina, a symbol of precision, truth, and the skills he had bequeathed to her. Next to it sat a large, beautiful nugget of raw gold, pulled from Alistair's lode, a symbol of the legacy she had inherited and the future she was building. The tool and the treasure, the knowledge and the resource, together. They were 2 halves of the same inheritance. She looked out the window at the bustling community she had built, at the families who now called this valley home. The small, insulting sum of money her uncle had given her was long forgotten. The real inheritance her grandfather had left her wasn't something that could be spent, but something that could be used. It was the knowledge in her head and the strength in her hands. The gold from Alistair Finch had been the fuel, but the skills from her grandfather had been the engine. Looking out at the life she had forged from a ruin, she knew with a deep, unshakable certainty that the $50 she had paid to a laughing clerk for a hole full of water was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.